Imagine this. A war-hardened commander, the kind who has seen decades of blood and steel, scoffs at a young recruit, mocking her not because of her skills, but because of her age, because she looked no older than his granddaughter. What he didn't know was that this girl would walk straight into hell, survive the kind of battles that broke seasoned men, and come out draped in not one, not two, but 5 Purple Hearts, each medal a story of survival, defiance, and courage that defied every expectation. Before we dive into her unbelievable journey, hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're a reminder of the grit and fire that still beats in the heart of the next generation. And trust me, you won't want to miss the twists that are about to unfold. She was barely 19, her boots too new, her uniform still stiff, and her eyes carrying that dangerous mix of innocence and determination that only the young ever truly possess. And as she stood in front of the commander during her first deployment briefing, the man's laugh echoed through the tent, sharp and dismissive. "She's just my granddaughter's age," he chuckled to the squad, waving a hand as if dismissing her presence altogether. And in that moment, she felt the weight of every sneer, every whispered doubt that had trailed her since boot camp. Yet deep down, she made a silent promise that she would not only prove him wrong, she would rewrite the very idea of what a soldier could endure. The first trial came faster than expected. A midnight ambush in the mountains where shadows moved like ghosts and the air cracked with gunfire. And as seasoned men dropped in chaos, she found herself charging forward, dragging a wounded comrade across rocky ground while bullets chewed the dirt beside her body trembling not from fear but from the sheer refusal to let anyone die under her watch. And though shrapnel tore across her leg that night, leaving her bleeding and limping, she refused evacuation, staying with her unit until the firefight ended at dawn. And when the smoke cleared and the medics stitched her flesh, the commander could no longer laugh, for the first Purple Heart was pinned on her chest not out of pity, but because she had carried herself through hell on sheer grit. Yet what no one knew then was that this was only the beginning of a journey where every step forward demanded blood, where trust would be broken, allies would fall, and the girl mocked as a child would soon become the ghost story enemies whispered about in fear. For fate had already marked her for trials far crueler than anyone around that campfire could have imagined. The scar on her leg had barely healed when the next storm broke, a deployment deeper into hostile territory where the mountains gave way to labyrinthine villages filled with suspicion, silence, and hidden rifles. And though she carried the fresh pain of her first wound, she refused to fall behind, moving with the unit as if her very blood was fuel for her resolve. The commander, though still skeptical, began to notice the way she never flinched when gunfire cracked, how her eyes stayed sharp when others crumbled, and in the second ambush, this time from rooftops and narrow alleys that turned the village into a death trap. She once again put herself in the line of fire, this time shielding a fellow soldier from a grenade blast with nothing but her body and quick reflexes, the explosion flinging her against a wall with a force that shattered her ribs and filled her lungs with fire. Yet when the dust settled, she staggered back to her feet, coughing blood but still firing until the last enemy gun fell silent. And that night, as she lay in the field hospital, the commander's hands trembled when he pinned the second Purple Heart on her, not out of ceremony but out of shame for ever having doubted her spirit. But fate wasn't finished with her, because the third test came like a betrayal that cut deeper than shrapnel, when whispers of an informant among their own began to surface, and trust dissolved into paranoia, and she, still considered too young by many, was assigned to watch duty during a supply run, only to discover that the betrayal was real, a comrade she had eaten with, trained with, and trusted, now selling coordinates to the enemy for promises of escape. And though her hand shook as she confronted him, the moment was stolen by a sudden sniper shot that ripped through the convoy, chaos exploding all around, and in the swirl of smoke, and treachery she had to choose between saving the betrayer or saving the rest of the squad, and her instincts drove her to drag two wounded brothers to safety while enemy fire rained down, her own shoulder torn open by a bullet that refused to stop her legs from running. And by the end of that bloody day, the betrayer was dead, killed not by her hand, but by the very enemies he fed, and the squad survived because she bled in their place, her third Purple Heart carved into her flesh, like a reminder that every medal came with ghosts. That night, as the commander stood outside her tent watching her sleep with bandages wrapped around half her body, he muttered to himself that she was no longer just his granddaughter's age. She was something beyond youth, beyond soldiering, a creature of sheer defiance. And though he would never admit it aloud, he began to fear what wars like this were doing to her soul, because each test was changing her, stripping pieces of innocence away and forging something far sharper, something the world was not ready to reckon with. War is never merciful, and by the time her third wound had barely closed into stiff pink scars, the unit was reassigned to a valley outpost that felt more like a coffin than a base, surrounded on all sides by cliffs and enemy trails, where every night brought whispers of movement and every sunrise revealed fresh signs of encirclement. And though the commander had once laughed at her, now he leaned on her instincts, often asking for her read on the terrain before making moves, because she had developed that strange, unteachable gift of sensing danger before it struck. But even her sharpened senses could not prepare them for the night. The valley erupted, when hundreds of insurgents poured down like a storm of shadows and gunfire turned the dark into a flashing inferno. The outpost walls shook with RPG blasts, sandbags burst apart, men screamed in chaos, and in that chaos she rose not as the girl mocked for her age, but as the anchor of the defense, sprinting through fire to relay ammo, dragging the half-dead into cover, firing until her rifle overheated, and then switching to sidearm with hands slick in blood. And when the southern wall collapsed under mortar fire, she was the first to charge into the breach, hurling grenades and shouting orders like a veteran twice her age, her voice cutting through the madness with a clarity that pulled men back from the edge of panic. But the siege was merciless. Hours of endless waves, and by dawn she was running on pure adrenaline, her body broken in ways she couldn't even feel yet, because a blast had thrown her from the barricade, tearing muscle and burning skin across her back. Yet even as medics begged her to lie down, she staggered up again, clutching a rifle and firing from her knees, refusing to surrender the ground until reinforcements finally arrived, and when the dust cleared, the outpost was a graveyard of smoke and silence. Bodies both friend and foe scattered in grotesque stillness. And there, in the heart of the carnage, the commander found her slumped against a wall, barely breathing, her uniform shredded and blackened, but her grip still tight around. Her weapon as if even unconscious she would not let it go. She awoke 2 days later in a field hospital, lungs scorched, body wrapped in bandages like a mummy, and the commander himself stood at her bedside with eyes that no longer held mockery but something far heavier, guilt, awe, maybe even fear, as he pinned the fourth Purple Heart onto the blanket covering her chest, whispering words no one else heard. "You're no soldier's granddaughter anymore. You're the soldier I wish my grandsons had become." And though his voice trembled with pride, she turned her face away, staring at the ceiling with hollow eyes, because by now she had seen too much, buried too many. And though the medals shone like honor to others, to her they felt like weights dragging her soul deeper into a darkness she wasn't sure she would ever escape. By the time the scars of the siege faded into pale reminders across her back, the young soldier who had once been mocked for being the age of someone's granddaughter was no longer seen as a child by anyone who had survived beside her. And yet the cruel reality of war is that it never stops asking for more. And so the order came down for one last mission, an operation so reckless it felt like a death sentence, a deep insertion into enemy territory to extract a captured intelligence, officer whose knowledge could turn the tide of the entire conflict. The commander, now haunted by the idea of losing her, argued against her inclusion, but she insisted with that cold fire in her eyes that told him refusal was useless. And so under the cloak of night they moved, a small team slipping through jagged ravines and hostile checkpoints until they reached the compound where the officer was held. But the silence was wrong, too perfect, and she sensed it before anyone else. The trap snapped shut with a thunderclap of gunfire and explosions, the compound erupting into a maelstrom of bullets and fire, and in the chaos the officer was dragged out half dead, the squad cut down one by one, and she knew in that instant that survival would demand a sacrifice. Sprinting through firestorms that lit the sky orange, she hurled herself into the enemy ranks with a fury born not of rage, but of unbreakable defiance, shielding the officer's body with her own, firing until every magazine was empty, stabbing, clawing, fighting like a storm-given flesh. And even as rounds tore through her side and her blood slicked the ground, she refused to fall until the evac bird thundered overhead. In the final moments, with vision blurred and lungs drowning in blood, she dragged the officer into the chopper with strength that came from somewhere deeper than flesh, collapsing only when the rotors lifted them clear of the inferno, and when the medics pulled her back from the edge of death once again. The commander stood over her hospital bed with tears in his weathered eyes, pressing the fifth Purple Heart against her chest with shaking hands, whispering not as a commander, but as a man who had witnessed a miracle. "You're no longer just a soldier. You're the reason we still believe." And word of her survival spread like wildfire across the camps, across the homeland, across the seas, until her name became legend, a tale mothers told their children, a ghost story enemies feared in the dark. And yet inside her, the medals were not trophies but gravestones, each one etched with the names of those she could not save. But still she stood, scarred and unbroken, because some souls are forged not for peace, but for fire. And though the world might remember her as the girl who earned 5 Purple Hearts, she knew the truth, that she was the child the commander once mocked, the warrior fate demanded, and the living proof that age is nothing when the heart refuses to surrender. And so the story ends not with her fading into silence, but with her walking back into the smoke, a legend still in motion, a soldier still fighting, and a reminder to every generation after that courage has no age, only the fire to endure.